If you don't know me, I'm Michael Kilkelly from ArchSmarter, and this workshop is the Effective Architect 25 Ways to Work Smarter. And this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and I see this workshop kind of as the cornerstone for what I'm trying to do at ArchSmarter. Now today, my goal is to try and answer two questions. One, is it possible to create better work in less time? And two, how can we as architects, designers, engineers work smarter, not harder? The reality is that project schedules are getting shorter and shorter. Building types are getting more complex. The number of pages in the code book is growing exponentially. Now, there's only so many hours in the day. Nobody's created an app or a software or a service to make more hours. So we have to work smarter. We need to design better, faster. Now, why is this important? Well, for you personally, and for me, like when I produce better results and I'm more effective and productive, I become a more valuable asset for my firm or for my clients. And that leads to faster advancement for you if you're working for a firm and hopefully higher pay. Now, this gives you ideally more time for life, for things like friends and family, health, hobbies, those sorts of things, so it's not just about working all the time. Ideally, we're trying to create a way to get at, how to have a better life, how to work smart. And ultimately, by designing more with less, being more productive, we can make the world a better place in some way, shape, or form. So that's sort of the big picture goal. Now, I see this as an interactive session. So if you have questions, just type them into the question box, and I'll try to answer them as we go along. Otherwise, I'll try to follow up with you afterwards. And for this session, I don't have all the answers. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I want to share some of the stuff that I've discovered that's worked for me. But I'm always looking for new techniques and ways of doing things. So if you have, suggestions, comments, put them into the question box, email me later, all that stuff. Again, I'm trying to figure out a way that I can work as effective as I can. Now, I'm curious about, for you, what are you hoping to get out of this session? And maybe more specifically, like what particular challenges are you facing, in your work? What are things that you would like to get better at? What are things that you would like, that you would like to see improved? Sorry, I meant to kept talking and I didn't change the slide. So a couple of things, challenges that I have in particular. One of them is that, it's just managing email. So I have multiple email accounts. I have one for Space Command. I have one for ArchSmarter. I have two or three personal accounts, and I have a hard time just keeping track of everything. So email comes in like a flood. And if you've ever emailed me and I haven't gotten back to you in a reasonable amount of time, I really apologize. I'm just trying to keep my head above the email water. And, one of the other things that I have that I'm trying to get better at also is just learning new things. I mean, there's always new technology that comes out. There's new things in terms of like continuing education within architecture, construction, trying to learn, stay up to date with things within the profession. And so finding the time to do that, and also finding the time finding the best way to kind of learn those new things has been a challenge. So I'm always trying to see how I can kind of optimize that process. Now, let me give you a little bit of background. I don't know if I've ever, certainly haven't written anything about this on ArchSmarter, although I probably will in the near future. But this is kind of my, my background story. And this picture is not me, but that's certainly how I felt on the inside. And this is back in 2007. And at this time, I was working at Frank Gehry's office in LA, and I was working on this big mixed-use project in New York. And I was the new guy in the office, and I was the new guy on the team. So at the end of each project phase, it fell onto me to be the one who packaged up all the drawings, get everything ready to send out to the consultant, to the contractor, and to the owner. So the really low point, happened on a Friday. So I'd been working like crazy all week. I'd already put in 60, 70 hours that week, and we're just going on a deadline, trying to get, I think it was like 50% DD deadline. So we got all the drawings, everything finished by 6. And again, my job was the one who kind of packaged everything up. So everybody finished, and then they left and went out to the bar to get a drink to celebrate, completing the deadline. Well, I had to stay back in the office and basically clean everything up, clean up the mess that everybody had made, package everything up, and then, get it ready to ship out the door. So I had to go through all the plans. We were using AutoCAD at this point, in addition to CATIA for the 3D model. Clean things up, purge, make PDFs, all that stuff. Then I had to, bind the drawings up and then send them out. And, it's pretty standard stuff, but the drawings were big and complicated. It was a big job. And it took me almost about an hour to do each floor plan. And so the building had 8 floor plans. So, you do the math, that's 8 hours of additional work I had to do after everybody was done. So again, I had already put in a full day, and then I'm there for another day basically doing this work. And I realized at this point when I finished, and it was like 2 or 3 in the morning, my head's pounding, my eyes are red for staring at the morning, that I need to find a better way to do this, that I couldn't keep doing this because we had another deadline coming up in a few weeks, and it was just going to, I would not survive. So, I went home for the weekend, took a rest, slept for a whole lot of time. And I came in on Monday and I realized, okay, I've got to start looking at this a little bit more systematically. And it's not that the work was difficult, it just took time. It's not like I'm getting paid overtime, so it's time, that I'd rather spend doing other things. And also when I get that tired, I make a lot of mistakes, careless mistakes that then I have to undo. It takes even longer. So even, if it should take me an hour, when I'm that tired, it's probably going to take me 2 because I'm going to mess something up as I go. So at that point on Monday, I committed myself, I got to work smarter. So I would need to automate this process. I don't want to stay up late. So I went through and I outlined all the steps, and I tried to figure out a way that I could, write a macro or do something that would make it easier so I didn't have to do all that work. So I started looking at, coding and getting it into that way. And so a few weeks later, I had to do this process again. And I had hacked together this kind of system, and it wasn't pretty at all. I'd hate to look at the code now. But now this time it only took me 4 hours. So I was able to remove some of those steps and have basically automate them. And then a month later, and I had a few more iterations in my process, and I kept fine-tuning it, and I had it down to 2 hours. So I kept at it, and then finally I got it to under an hour, which is 8 times faster. So I could do all this work, which took me 8 hours to do manually. I got it down to 1 hour. And what's better, since the process was really automated for the most part, and I had written out all the steps, I could direct other people to do it. So when our big CD deadline came around, I was the first one at the bar to celebrate that night, which was a huge personal victory for me, having gone through that process to systematize how, that do the work that I used to have to do manually. So this experience was a real big turning point for me. So I started to look at ways that I could optimize other parts of my work. I saw the value just, within my own quality of life by doing that. So I wanted to work smarter in other areas as well. Again, because I was the direct beneficiary of it. And it also helped in addition to giving me extra time, since I wasn't at the office late all the time, it helped me in my career. And when the economy took a downturn in 2009, the office laid off about half, the staff, because we had a couple of big projects that just went on hold and disappeared. So I was known as being somebody who was very effective and efficient, and I could also help project teams get more efficient. So we went through this big churn, and fortunately, I was able to keep my job through that time and beyond. Now, what I want for you is hopefully at the end of this session, you'll come out of it with some strategies, some tools, some tactics that you can put into place at work, tomorrow or Monday. Maybe you can't spend your whole day swinging in a hammock, which would be nice, but if you can take this material and make Monday a little bit more bearable, or if you can, leave a little bit early on Friday, then I've definitely done my job. Now, a lot of this is kind of common sense, but what's difficult that I found anyways is putting that into practice and sticking with it. So it's like developing, habits for working smarter. Okay, so I've structured this workshop into 5 parts, and these are the 5 areas that I think of make up the effective architect. And so we're going to go into each one, and I'll talk about strategies you can implement, and then we'll talk about tools that you can use to help you in this area. All right, so let's get started. Now let's talk about planning your work, and this is kind of the essential step. It's a way to start thinking about your work, not as necessarily as something that needs to get done, but to think a bit more strategic about it. And for me, this gets into the relationship between efficiency and effectiveness. Ideally, we want to be both effective and efficient. But if we think about it, efficiency is really about doing things right. Effectiveness is more importantly about doing the right things. So you can be really efficient, but you're not very effective if you're not working on the right things. So say you're doing a series of like roof edge details. You can draft really fast. You can crank up like 4 or 5 details an hour. But if they're not the right details, it doesn't matter how fast you are, because you're never going to get to the right place, and you're going to waste a lot of time regardless of how fast you are. You might waste less time because you can do it fast, but again, you're not moving in the right direction. So ideally, you want to focus on being effective first. That way, when you're clear on where you're going, you can work on getting faster and more efficient. Again, you're setting the direction first, and then you're working on your speed. Now, one story I like to talk about is my son. He's playing violin. He started off and he was really, really terrible, like that screechy, scratchy sound. If you have kids who play violin, you know what I'm talking about. He's gotten a lot better. He's been playing for about 4 years. And now he's at the point where he wants to play full speed. So he wants to play like his instructor, as fast as she goes. She's been doing it for 30 years, so she's really, really good. But she tells him, though, if you want to play fast, then you have to really learn to play slow. That way you understand, the music and its nuances. And then once you understand that and you've kind of committed that tune into your muscle memory, then you can work on playing faster. So I really like that idea that you have to play you have to play slow in order to play fast. And I think about that as far as, my own work, and that a lot of times I need to work slow so I understand exactly what I'm doing. And then I can start working on the speed. And that, to me, is that idea of being more effective first and then working on increasing my efficiency. Okay, so let's talk about that in more depth. And one of the first things I like to think about is what's called the 80-20 principle. And this is also known as the Pareto Principle. And now Pareto was an Italian economist who in 1896, he wrote a paper that showed that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the people. And he looked at land ownership in other countries as well and found out that was remarkably consistent. Now, fast forward about 60 years, and in the U.S. there's a management consultant by the name of Joseph Duran, and he came across Pareto's research, and he started looking at it in other areas, and he found that it was also remarkably consistent, not just dealing with land ownership. And he called this phenomenon the vital few and the trivial many. And essentially what it comes down to is that 80% of results will come from 20% of effort. And it's not necessarily, it's not exactly 80-20 all the time, but you see that, again, the majority of results will come from, a minimum portion of the effort. So if you think about your own work and like, how do we apply this to architecture and design? If you were to look at, your firm and where your work comes from or where your revenue comes from, in all likelihood, 80% of your revenue would most likely come from 20% of your clients. Or if you're doing construction administration, I'd be willing to bet that close to 80% of RFIs are going to come from just 20% of the building. And so if you want to be strategic, then you focus your documentation on those areas. You do your research, where if you find that magic 20% of clients that are giving you 80% of your revenue, then you focus on building and strengthening those relationships. Likewise, on the design side, that I bet that 80% of the photographs that you take, of a finished project are, again, of that 20% of the building. And so it would make sense, if you look at it strategically across the board, to apply more design effort to those areas. Those are the ones that really matter. And then in your own work too, I bet, you probably do 80% of your work in 20% of the time, of actual measurable work. So the trick with this is understanding, which is that 20% that really matters, and then doubling down on those areas, because those are the ones that drive your results. So a lot of it is looking at data, looking at trends, within how you work, what you're working on, and trying to be strategic about what you focus on. Now, with that in mind, taking that 20%, it comes down to really looking at, your high-value activities. And what are your high-value activities? Well, those are those 20% of the Pareto Principle. And also, though, in addition to the activities that drive results, they're the ones that you can typically do better than anyone on your team. And identifying, your particular strengths in your team, in your office, allows you to leverage those strengths, and then you get maximum results with minimum effort. So, high-value activities get you results, but they also are tailored to your own personal strengths. Now, I always think of leverage, like a lever. So you're using a lever, you can move a lot of weight with just a minimal amount of effort. So this guy's going to move, this concrete barrier just using, this 4x4 and a little bit of, another one just to leverage that up. And one of the issues I think within design construction is that, we're working on buildings that are typically one-off. We don't have a lot of leverage, at least from project to project. And so I think the trick for us is then to find out, we're not making products. Like we're not going to design one iPhone and we're going to sell millions of it. We're designing one building in one site for one client. So we need to look for ways that we can leverage the work we're doing in other ways so that, it comes down to like having a standardized process, which we'll talk about a little bit later, using templates, just being smart about how we work so we can create leverage that way. Again, since our project work isn't, we're not going to replicate a million buildings, at least hopefully not. Now, thinking about leverage and maximizing your leverage gives you the biggest bang for your time. Again, time is a finite resource. We can't make any more of it. But the ways that we can leverage our time and maximize, our effectiveness allows us to get a lot further, get a lot more results than we would ordinarily. So I practice Judo, and one of the founding principles of Judo is that idea. It's maximum results for minimum effort. And Judo is not about fighting strength with strength, but it's about using your opponent's momentum to unbalance and then throw them to the ground. So if your opponent pushes, then you pull them. And if your opponent pulls you, then you push back. So it's about using their balance and their momentum against them. Essentially, it's about applying leverage. So we can approach our work in a lot of the same ways. If we don't have a lot of time, then we really need to focus on what's important, apply our own personal strengths, and maximize our leverage to get the maximum result. So our third kind of strategy is to take this a little bit more tactical. It is to outline your process. So we've talked about, identifying our 20%. We've talked about maximizing and working on high-value activities. One way to start to do this is to outline your process. So if you start, you're starting a new project, how are you going to break that down? How do the various steps break down? And one saying that I really like is this notion of how do you eat an elephant? So, elephants are big. If you had to eat one, it's kind of gross, but how do you approach it? Well, the saying goes, you do it one bite at a time. You take that first bite, get it down, take the second bite, the third bite, and on and on and on. So when you're starting a new project, it's always a huge undertaking. But if you break it down into steps, that first step isn't so bad when you know what the next step and the next step is. So you focus on one step at a time. Now, breaking your project or your task into steps does two things. One, it makes sure you know where you're going. And two, it gives you the opportunity to analyze and fine-tune the process. Maybe you can start to eliminate some steps, or you can make the process more efficient. But it comes down to that notion of applying, kind of a design attitude towards it. Outlining, here's where I start from, here's where I end, here's how I'm going to get there. One thing that I really like for outlining is mind mapping software. So here's a mind map that I created for this presentation. And the software is really great for us visual thinkers. So mind maps typically consist of a central topic, which you can see right in the middle, and then branches come off that connect concepts or keywords. And what I like is that you can rearrange and arrange and rearrange by just dragging and dropping things. And the software maintains the relationship between your topics and your subtopics. So it's real easy to organize and reorganize the map as you work on it. When I was doing, basically laying out the outline for this presentation, doing it with mind mapping software helped me clarify my key points and then sort of develop the structure as I go. I use Xmind for mind mapping. I've been using it for a couple years now. I really like it. There's a bunch of other software as well. There's MindJet, MindView, iMind. There's some that are available as standalone software, and then there's some cloud services. But if you do a Google search for mind mapping, you'll see there's a whole bunch of options there. And I'm going to, when I send out the recording for the session, I'll also include a whole bunch of links. I did a post on ArchSmarter about a year ago that talks a little bit more in depth about mind mapping, so I'll make sure I include that as part of the link. Okay, another good strategy too, in addition to outlining your process, is to use checklists, especially if you have a task that you need to repeat, more than 3 or 4 times, over the course of a month or even for a year. Develop a checklist. This is my 3rd webinar, and I've developed, I don't know if you can see that, but I have my own webinar checklist. And so I use that basically when I start, here are the things I need to do. Because partly I had, an instance where I forgot to share my screen. And so I, started a webinar and I hadn't shared my screen for more time than I want to say. So I learned then, okay, I need to be very systematic about that. It's like pilots use checklists for their pre-check because they're effective and they work. If you have lots of little things to do, put them in the list. That way you can make sure that they get done. Checklists are great because they standardize your process. They make it repeatable and they make it predictable. And one thing when I was talking about my my sad story at the beginning, having a checklist that walked somebody through the process of how I had to clean up drawings was great, because then I could just give it to somebody and then they could start to use that. So it's a way to externalize your knowledge. This is a great book if you want to read more about checklists. This is Atul Gawande's Checklist Manifesto. This book is just about checklists. So Atul he's a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and he found checklists to be really effective in dealing with complexity during and after surgery. And you imagine all the things that have to happen during a surgery. You hear these stories about like clamps getting left in somebody's body and then they had to go back, and take them out, like really nasty stuff you don't imagine. Atul found through his research that checklists were a great way to ensure that everything got done, and they saw, the success rates of surgery skyrocket as a result of using these very effective tools. Now, another thing in terms of planning your work is to create a daily plan. There's, like when you get into work, what are you going to be working on? How is your day going to break up? Mapping out your day, helps you maintain control over your schedule, and it makes sure that you're making progress on the things that really matter. I use this is the Essential Daily Planner by a company called Productive Flourishing, which I found to be really helpful. I've also used, some other tools as well, which we'll talk about shortly. But I think the notion of really looking at how your day is going to lay out and trying also not to schedule it too full. You want to think about leaving some buffer in there, because last week my kids were sick, we had a snowstorm, like we had all sorts of stuff going on, but trying to find a way to map things out so you're making progress. And yeah, Tracy's asking, no, I don't actually use, I've been trying a bunch of different things. I find for me, I have my Moleskine notebook here that I swear by. And I also use some electronic tools. I use Todoist for kind of my to-do task, but I find most effectively writing stuff down works out best. Again, the jury's still out, but I like that for whatever reason. I like that act of putting things in. Yeah, I use a calendar as well. I have I think part of my problem may be that I have 3 or 4 systems that I use, and I have to get better at putting them down, because I do have an electronic calendar, which I really like. So I use Google Calendar, and then I also have my daily planner. I have my notebook. So that's my confession is that I'm still trying to figure out the best system. But typically, what I try to do is block out chunks of time. So not necessarily hourly. I will start the day and say, here are the things that I want to get done. And I know for my days, I will usually have 2 or 3 like 2-hour chunks of time. And so I try to fit tasks into those chunks as best I can. I also know, like in the morning, I tend to work better. I'm a lot more effective doing stuff. So if I have work that requires a lot of focus, I will try to get like a 3 or 4 hour chunk of time in the morning. And then the afternoon, right after lunch, I'm tired. I try to do like meetings and other types of activities at that time. So I've started thinking of my day, in these kind of chunks. And that's worked out pretty well. I like this. Webinars go in the afternoon. Not that they're not important, but I feel like I'm better at talking necessarily than sort of sitting down and doing focus work. I really like this image. This is Ben Franklin's daily plan. And he breaks it down into every hour, but you'll see he has blocks of 4-hour chunks of work. But I like, he's thought about his day kind of strategically and then figured out how to best manage his time and more importantly, manage his energy. I like if you look at hours 6, 7, 8, and 9, put things in their places, supper, music, diversion. That's not a bad way to do it. Okay, I did mention one of the things that I'm using in addition to my, my analog systems is I've started using this site called Todoist, which is a to-do list. And this has worked out pretty good because you can categorize your tasks and then you can add tasks and it keeps track of them. You can schedule them. I've used a whiteboard for a while and I find that Todoist is working better, partly because I can use it on any of my devices. So I can use it on my phone, I can use it through a browser, and that's working out pretty well. I still find, that I'm a little bit, I have, things in my notebook, I have things in Todoist, I have things on my calendar. So I'm working, that's my goal this year, is to get more systematic about, trying to have one place, if I can. We'll see. Now, it may also make sense for you too to look at some sort of project management software. There's lots of options out there. Trello is a good one if you're doing task management. Asana is another one too for project planning. Again, there's a whole bunch of options. I did this infographic on ArchSmarter a while back just because I was looking for some options that I could use. And kind of this is the fruits of the research. So I have a link to this as well, which I'll send you. I probably need to update it. But it gives you a good sense, too, of what the tools are out there and what their particular strengths and weaknesses are. Okay, so let's talk about your time. We talked about work. Let's talk about more specifically about your time. Now, I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. Time is one of our most precious resources. We can't make any more of it. There's no way to do it. You get 24 hours in a day. That's it. There's 168 hours in a week. So we need to be very strategic about how we use it. And in essence, we need to be very defensive with our time. Again, we only get this set amount. So we need to guard it. We need to protect it. But we also need to be realistic with it. You can't really schedule every minute of the day. At least I know I can't. You're going to get interrupted. You're going to have unforeseen, occurrences. Again, 6 kids, snowstorms, that sort of thing. Things are going to go late, like your car is going to break down. And that's why you want to build in some kind of buffer into your schedule. If you have, 8 hours at work, factor in maybe you're going to get about 6 hours of those will be productive if you're lucky. We tend to overestimate what we can do in a day, but we underestimate what we can do in a year. So you want to take the long-term view of your time and just work consistently. So one way to do that is to manage your time proactively, not reactively. So it's your time. You want to control it. Now, Stephen Covey, he's the author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He uses this analogy of a glass jar, and the glass jar represents your day. And so the idea is that you fill the jar with the big rocks first. Now, big rocks are the things that are most important to you, like, the things that are non-negotiable. This can be, anything like a particular project at work, time with your family, exercise, whatever. But those are the things you need to get done first. Now, once you've filled in all the big rocks, then you start adding smaller gravel. And once that is filled with the gravel, then you start adding the sand. And then once you fill, you can think about what's gravel. That's going to be stuff that's not quite as important, as your big stuff. Maybe it's, particular meetings at work or talking to specific clients or, and then the sand can be answering email or, playing Angry Birds or whatever. And then once you fill it with sand, then you add the water. And then at that point, once you have the water, it's all filled up. But you've made sure that all the important stuff, those big rocks, are in there. And, the whole idea is that you need to get your big rocks in first, otherwise you're not going to have any room. If you were to add the sand first, you're going to fill that jar up pretty quick. There's not going to be room for a lot of those rocks. And then once you add the water, again, there's not going to be much time for anything else. So again, the big rocks are what are most important to you. Everything else in the jar is going to be comparatively less important, and that can be, again, meetings, email, TV. So focus on your big rocks. Focus on getting those things that are done. And, don't try to overschedule or try to think you can get more done into a day because you'll probably drive yourself crazy and then you'll be discouraged. So if you take the long view, think about over the course of a year, focusing on the big rocks as opposed to just focusing too much on that particular day. So how do you determine what's important? And I like this image. It's called the Eisenhower decision matrix, and it's a framework you can use to determine which tasks to use. The idea is to map, a particular task by its importance and its urgency. So, if you deem something to be important and urgent, then you want to do it now. If it's important but not necessarily urgent, then you want to schedule that. And then anything that is not important and not urgent, delete it. And then if it's not important but urgent, try to get somebody else to do it. That's the best way. So this is kind of a useful way to think about tasks and put them into these 4 boxes. It's, it's always hard with certain things, especially work-related, because it may be, again, urgent for somebody, but not necessarily important for you. So you have to make that call. But this gives you a kind of framework to do that. So when you're thinking about urgent and important tasks, I really like this quote from Mark Twain. So Twain said that, if you have to eat a live frog first thing in the morning, nothing worse is going to happen to you the rest of the day. And so do that thing that you most don't want to do, the thing you most dread, first thing in the morning. Get it done and move on, And then if you have to do 2 things in the morning, so if you have to eat 2 frogs, eat the biggest frog first. So for me, I don't really like talking to people on the phone for whatever reason. It gives me a cold sweat. So I try to do, if I have to make phone calls, I try to do that first thing in the morning so I can get on, get that over with, get on to the other things. So again, think about frogs, think about big rocks, think about all that stuff. Now, another way to think about your time too is what's called the Pomodoro Technique. And the Pomodoro is a time management technique, and it's kind of interesting. The idea is to break your day into 25-minute chunks, and each chunk is called a Pomodoro, which is Italian for tomato. So you do a Pomodoro, you work head down, focused for 25 minutes, and then you take a 5-minute break. But during that 25 minutes, you're not checking email, you're not answering the phone, you're not surfing the web, you're just working. And the idea is to string together as many Pomodoros as you can over the course of a day. And then you set a goal and you just try to get that goal, achieve that goal. And it's hard, 25 minutes of focused concentration is tough. If you have 8 hours, you'd think you could do possibly 16 of these. But, that's really, requires a lot of focus. So this is one thing I'm trying to work on this year. I haven't actually put it into place. I might try to do it. I'm going to start with 1 day and maybe, try to get 4 Pomodoros in or something and just see. But from what I've heard, people who use this methodology have had some great results. And, they're consistently in a zone where they're working hard. Now, another idea in terms of managing time is not necessarily to work more, but to work less. Because working more hours doesn't mean that you're going to get more done. So it's Pencavel, he's an economics professor at Stanford. He studied worker productivity, and he found that productivity actually decreases after a certain number of hours worked in a week. So if you're working 70 hours in a week, you're really only getting 56 hours worth of production done. So those extra 14 hours that you were putting in, didn't get you anywhere. They didn't get you more production. If anything, you probably undid some things that you had done. So there's really a limit to how much we can work. Now, he was looking particularly at munitions workers who are doing manual work. But I can imagine, the drop-off in productivity is worse for, knowledge workers like us, like architects, designers, engineers, because we have to think, we have to create, we have to analyze. And I know I'm only good for a certain number of hours during the day, and after that, forget it. It's not worth it. It's going to take me, 2 or 3 hours to do a task that when I'm tired, that would have taken me an hour or even a half hour when I was fresh. So when I was in architecture school, the all-nighter was the badge of honor. And it showed that you were really serious about your work, you were putting the time in. And I think that a lot of us carry this attitude over into our professional, and into our working lives. We'll put more and more hours into a project to make it better. And the problem is, and the research shows that more hours doesn't necessarily result in better work. I think in some ways, if you had to work less, if you had to only work 4 hours a day, what would you work on to drive the most results? And that gives you a way to think about things. Like if you only had, an hour, what would you do with that hour? How could you get the most results out of that? So another thing to consider when you're thinking about this notion of working less is Parkinson's Law, which was stated by Cyril Parkinson in 1955. He was a civil servant in England, and he made this observation when he was looking at the proliferation of management within the civil service ranks in Great Britain at that time. The idea is if you have 20 hours to do a project, it's going to take you 20 hours. If you only had 5, it would take you 5. So you're going to fill that time. And again, if you can reduce the amount of time that you have to do the task, you can then focus on that result, focus on the things that matter. And one other thing to think about, this is another good resource. It's the 4-Hour Workweek, which is probably the best name for a book ever. And this is written by Tim Ferriss. And this book is a huge bestseller, and it has a whole bunch of productivity and time-saving techniques. So, I definitely recommend it. And he goes through, how you can really start to simplify and strip things down. It's interesting to look at this, from an architect's perspective, because again, some of it is applicable for sure, and some of it isn't. And I think that, how can you? That's one thing that I'm trying to figure out is that. How can these productivity ideas, techniques, strategies apply to architecture? So, Tracy, it's Timothy Ferriss is the author. And again, I think it's definitely a good read just to give you a kind of a different framework for thinking about work and thinking about how you can be more productive. And again, is it all of it necessarily applicable to architecture? No, not really, just given the nature of our work. But there's some stuff there that I think, can be integrated. So that's the kind of things I'm trying to figure out with ArchSmarter. So with that in mind, one thing that's really useful too is to see where your time goes and keep a time log. So Peter Drucker is a management guru, and he said, what gets measured gets managed. So if you want to better manage your time, one way to start is by keeping track of it and basically keep a time log to see where you're spending your time. So if you do this for a week, then review your findings. Are you spending too much time on email? Are there common distractions? Does somebody kind of interrupt you at a certain point of the day, every day? Is there a way to avoid that? Once you have that log, once you have the data, then you can start to look and see where you can improve, where you're spending your time, and how to use it more effectively. If you like writing stuff down, there's software that'll certainly help you with this. If you like an analog system, there's this image here is from the Self Journal. It's a notebook that helps you basically structure and record your day. It's available through the website Best Self. And I think the woman who created this was an architect, although she's not practicing now. So they had a big push on Kickstarter. I think they made $300,000, so there's definitely a need out there for these kind of tools that help us manage our time. For a digital solution, there's this tool called Rescue Time. And it's an app that runs in the background of your computer, and it records where basically what you're working on, like what applications you have open, what's in focus at the time, and how much time you're spending on that. It's a little bit scary because it gives you, a really kind of, it has that big brother feel, like what are you doing right now? It's recording everything, but it gives you a good indication of what you're doing throughout the year. So this is one thing that I'm going to try to implement this year. I just want to test it out and see how it works. I'm a little bit afraid because I'm afraid to see the results. It may tell me that I'm not really as effective or efficient as I should be, but that's something, though, I would be really interesting, even just doing it for a month, to see the data, basically. And a lot of this, I think, is about getting that data, gathering the data about your own methods, your own habits, the specifics of your type of work, and then using that to make some adjustments to how you work. Now, another thing to consider as well is this idea of single tasking. Now, multitasking is a myth. Like, you can't do it. The human brain doesn't work that way. There's been a lot of research that's been done at this, and essentially if you have, two people, one who is just working on a single task or a series of tasks in series, and then another person who is multitasking, the person who is single tasking is going to be much more efficient than the multitasker. And what happens is anytime you're switching tasks while you're multitasking, you actually pay what's called a context switching tax. So what it means is that it takes more time to switch from one task to the other because your brain has to reorient itself to that new task. Like, you have to kind of get in the groove. Oh, okay, what was I just doing? All right, let me get there. Even if it takes a couple seconds, over the course of like an hour spent multitasking, that's a lot of time that you're wasting. If you have to work on multiple projects, one idea, and this is true for a lot of us, is to dedicate a day of the week for each project. And that way you can focus on the specifics of that project and those particular issues. So if somebody calls about another project, ask them to call back. Oh, I'm not working on that project today. Call me back another day. And I worked with a guy who used this method. He had like 4 different healthcare projects going on at the same time. And I was like, Tim, how do you do this? How do you keep track of all this stuff? And he said that he basically broke it out. Each project had a day, and he would only work on that project that particular day. And it took some training for the client and the consultants because they would call him and he'd say, no, call me back on Wednesday. But after a while, people got, on the program, and he was able to keep his sanity and also simultaneously complete these 4 projects. So I thought that was a really interesting way, to do it. And again, you're not paying that context switching task. Now, another thing too, if you have to do a lot of similar tasks, is to batch them all together. So if you have to make a lot of phone calls, you can do them all at one time. If you have to do a lot of email, do that at the same time. If you're going to redline, even if you have to do tasks that are of a similar nature. So if you have to redline details and then you need to edit specs, like those are kind of similar because it is an editing process. If you have to do a project estimate in Excel and then you need to work on a project timeline in Excel, do those similar. So again, you're keeping some consistency from one task to the next. So the idea would be to group by the type of task or by the application that you're using. And again, these things are similar enough in nature that you're not going to have to pay that context switching task. Okay, let's see, how are we doing on time? Oh, I'm running this a little bit late, but let's keep going here. So manage your information. I mentioned before, my email, I'm trying to keep my head above water with my email. I always think of it, in that idea, like all that information that's coming in is sort of like a river. And I have information that's coming in and going out. So I have emails, phone calls. You're probably the same way. You have meetings, memos, everything. Some days it's going to be a steady, manageable flow. Other days it's like this. You're riding the rapids and you're just trying to stay on top of that flow. So here are some strategies about how to deal with that. Now, one of the most fundamental ways is to start where you work and to look at decluttering, your own personal environment. So does your desk happen to look like this? Mine's not quite this bad. I can't move the camera around, but I've probably got more stuff here than I really need. My problem is I always have these stacks of magazines that someday I'm going to read. but, I'm embarrassed to say I probably never will. So it turns out that a cluttered desk is actually really bad for your productivity. Visually, if you have a lot of distractions, even if you're not consciously thinking about all those things, subconsciously your brain is registering like, oh, there's, a set of drawings I need to review. Over here, there's that book I haven't read. It actually will mentally take you away from the tasks at hand. And I think this is something, a lot of architects that I know I have this personal tendency too. I'm sort of a pack rat. I like to have stuff around. It's kind of messy and creative. But at the same time, you do pay a penalty for that. It is a distraction. The idea that out of sight, out of mind, applies to your desk. That way, if you don't have something out there, you're not necessarily going to be thinking about it. So keep only the most used items on your desk. If you have, stuff that you're going to get to later, try to figure out a way to put it away so you're not seeing it, you're not getting distracted about it. Also, keep like things together. So if you have certain, drawing supplies, trace, anything like that, stuff you're going to write on, keep that together so you don't have to really go searching around too much for it. So you can think of your desk really as kind of a tool and arrange it, sort of like you would the desktop on your computer having, depending on how you organize your apps. So keep things close by, but think about it, apply some design thinking about how you're going to work, what you're going to need to reach, where your phone is going to be, that kind of thing. So, my desk right now is probably somewhere in between the last desk in the previous slide and then this one here. This one here is maybe a little bit too obsessive for me. So there's definitely a balance between keeping your desk clean and then being obsessed about keeping it clean. So, you want it clean enough, but not so clean that you're spending all your time cleaning it instead of working in it, so it's definitely a fine balance. And I've heard stories, I've never worked in a firm like this, but I've always heard stories about other firms, and I think they're mostly like the British minimalists who wouldn't allow anything on your desk, like there was a certain aesthetic that had to be maintained. And it seemed kind of crazy to me, but maybe there's something there. It's a good question, Tracy, about stuff on the walls. I think there's definitely probably, that's a similar thing. It's sort of visual clutter to some degree. So I think you would want to approach it as well, like what needs to be on the walls. Is it useful for what you're doing? Is it going to help you, or is it going to be a distraction? And I think that's the filter, is this going to be a distraction, or is it going to help me in some way, shape, or form? I'm curious, do any of you work in firms or offices where there are requirements about what you can and can't have on your desk? Or have you ever worked in a firm like that? And, what was that like? I've always been in firms that were sort of messy, lots of stuff around. But I always wonder, if there were rules, what does that do for productivity? What kind of environment is that like? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So with that in mind, talking about distractions on our desk, we have all these devices now. We have things that are always clamoring for our attention. So my phone chimes every time that I get a text. I actually had to turn it off during this webinar so I'm not distracted while I'm talking. I get email chirps when I get a new message. I have another sound that goes off when somebody signs up for ArchSmarter. So, when this happens, what do? Most of the time, I'm going to stop whatever I'm doing and I'm going to go check my phone. I'm going to check my email and see what's going on. So we have more things to distract us now than ever before. And all they're doing is keeping us from getting our most important work done. So, try this. There's been research done, when you get a text, when you get an email, your brain actually gets a shot of dopamine. So there's sort of like a thrill that is associated with getting these notifications. Again, though, it is a distraction. So I strongly, strongly recommend this. Basically, at your desk right now, turn off your email notifications, change your phone settings to vibrate or turn it off altogether. Turn off all your social media notifications. So for Facebook or Twitter, all that stuff. You don't need any more distractions. And then this way you can say, okay, I'm going to have, 5 or 10 minutes right now to check all that stuff, as opposed to allowing it to distract you while your head is down and you're trying to get work done. Now, the internet is another big distraction, as we all know. Like, I'll always get some random thought while I'm working that I need to Google, like, right that instant. Some movie that I saw back in the 80s. Oh, who was that actor? And I'll go and Google it. So it's a huge distraction. And it's usually 9 times out of 10, 80% of the time at least, it's something pretty stupid that can wait. So one way to force yourself to focus is to use software like this software Freedom. The idea behind it is that it basically blocks your access to the internet for a set period of time. It's kind of sad, that we need to use something like this, but it's really, really effective. So, you basically set a time period, you'd say 2 hours, and then essentially it is going to lock you out of the internet until that time period is up. It's kind of like, forcing your hand. So this is another thing I'm going to experiment with this year and see how it works out. Like I said, it's kind of sad that we need it, but again, the internet is such a distraction that I think some ways it's good to kind of go low tech, go offline, and just sit down and get work done. So does anybody here like meetings? Raise your hand. I'm not a big fan. When I worked on the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi Museum at Gary's office, and I was a job captain on the project, and we'd have a job captain's meeting every Monday. So it was a big project, and there was 22 of us job captains. There was something like 70 or 80 people working on the project. And during this job captain's meeting, we'd go around the table, and everybody would report on what they're working on. So it took like at least 2 hours to go through. And, most of the time, like the meeting would get somebody would go off the rails, and by the time it got to you, everybody else was checked off, and it would have worked out better in most cases just to have more focused kind of individual meetings, or even to send people to send out an email. Here's what's going on. Here's what I need to interface. Here's the coordination that I need to work on, rather than gathering everybody together to do it. If you think about too that you have 22 almost 30 people in that meeting for 2 hours, just the cost and expense to the owner and to the client for that, it's probably not the best use of fee, to get that done, depending on what the outcomes were. In a lot of cases, the outcomes weren't significant enough to warrant that kind of a meeting. So the first thing to ask is, to determine whether or not, if you have to have a meeting or are asked to have a meeting, determine whether or not it's actually all that necessary. What's the desired outcome for the meeting, and can it be derived? Could you get that outcome from an email or from a phone call? If you do have to have the meeting, then set an agenda, write up an agenda with desired outcomes. Try to keep the number of outcomes at a minimal, like 3 items or less, and then also give a time limit for each item, and then stick to that agenda and stick to it, basically, that time frame. So it forces people to make decisions, be succinct, to not go off randomly, on off-topic stuff, but stay focused. Amazon has some really interesting practices that they use, and they have these things called reading meetings. And the idea is if you're going to have a meeting, you actually need to prepare a 6-page memo that basically outlines your argument, what you're looking for, the desired outcome, what decisions you need made. So at the beginning of the meeting, you hand out the memo to all of the participants. Everybody reads. And then at that point, there'll be a discussion about the various points. But the idea is if you are hosting the meeting, you have to really think through what you're going to say, what your argument is, what your desired outcome is. So you really have to focus on what you're looking for. And so it has allowed them to keep their meetings to very tight time frames, because again, what needs to be said is being written out and being thought through. And then the meeting becomes about, the discussion and then the decision, and that's it. And there's other ways you can try this as well. I mean, that's sort of one extreme, but even doing like stand-up meetings. So you have a meeting where there's no chairs, and that's going to keep things moving along quickly, because your body's going to get tired of standing up. You're not going to want to stand up for a 2-hour or 3-hour meeting. The other way to do it would be a walking meeting. So essentially you just go for a walk. You have a loop. The meeting lasts the duration of that loop, and then you kind of come to your decision. So it works great for small group meetings, like 3 or 4 people. Now, again, going back to your flow of information, another way to think about your email more specifically is to think of like your inbox like a factory, all right? So you don't want to read your email. Instead, you want to process it. So that email software is making steel or is making something. So you have your raw inputs, and that's going to be your emails coming in. And then the outputs that you're hoping to get out of this is the information, is actions. So we're information workers, so we should start processing our data that we're getting through email into information. And the idea, the way to do this is to limit the number of times you check your email. So 1 to 2 times a day, and then do it at set times. So like at 11 a.m., check your email, and then at 4 p.m. And like, I know this is really, really hard. This is definitely hard for me. I haven't been able to do this yet. I know I should. And what I've read for people who've done this, like it's sort of life-changing, and, but it's hard to break that habit. Again, you get that shot of dopamine, when you get an email. So I'll check my email probably a lot more than I should. And another suggestion also is not to check your email first thing in the morning. So you want to be proactive with your time, not reactive. So you get into the office, you've planned out your day, you start working on that first thing, and then later in the day, check your email, and then, figure out what you're going to do. If there's certain urgent things, deal with them at that point. But at least you've done that thing, the most important thing for you that day. Again, this is something that I'm definitely working on. I'm not there yet, but we'll see. I'm still trying. Another thing to do, and this is something that I've actually found to be really effective, is to use message filters. So the idea is that as your email's coming in, you can scan the email and look for specific keywords, and then have that email go to specific folders. And it allows you to just basically look at your folders. So if you're expecting an email from a client, rather than having to go into your inbox every time to see if that particular email came, all I have to do is look and see if I have an email in that particular folder. So I can look for things a lot more easily, rather than having to go through the 50 or 100, or at this point I think I'm up to 300 or so emails that are in my inbox. Now, I also use this too. I'm able to kind of separate out specific messages. So if messages have if it says subscribe, if it's a newsletter I've subscribed to, I can have those emails go into another folder that I look at. I know it's not going to be, client or project related stuff. Those are going to be, email newsletters and things like that. I can look at that when I have time. So I found that that's been a really good way to kind of route my email into appropriate places. So another idea, and this is a bit more on the extreme end, is this whole philosophy of inbox zero. And basically, the idea is that when you have email come in, you do one of 3 things. You either do whatever is in the email, you delegate it to somebody else, or you delete it. And the notion is that you're only handling your email once. So you're going through and you're making that decision very, very quickly. So I've tried this. I managed to get a totally clean inbox for like a day and a half, and then it just went right back to where everything else was. So it takes a lot of discipline to do that. I'm not there yet. I'm not sure I'm going to try that this year. That was a lot of effort. This is another technique that I thought was pretty interesting, especially if you use Evernote as kind of a digital notebook. When you have Evernote, you actually get assigned an email address. And so what you can do is when you sign up for a newsletter or any kind of online, like you sign up for ArchSmarter, for example, the email address that you could use your Evernote email. And then what happens is as they send you email, it's going to go straight into Evernote, and so that you can use that as a way to kind of sort and filter and search through the various newsletters that you've gotten. This sounds really interesting, and this is something I'm actually curious to test out. And again, if you're a big Evernote user, you're already in the application, so that could be a good way to kind of separate out your email. Now, another way to deal with email and messaging is to use something like Slack. It's an alternative communication tool. So I'm curious if anybody here is using Slack at all, or have heard about it at least. Basically, if you haven't heard about it, it's kind of a messaging app for teams. It's really, really, really easy to use. And you can create all these various Slack channels for different projects that you're on or even different communities. And, the interface looks kind of like this. It's very simple. You can access it through your phone. You can access it through the browser, and they also have an application. So this is a Slack that I belong to for, architects who are interested in kind of internet-related things. So we're able to chat and then follow our chat historically, do searches. So rather than sending emails, we're just conversing back and forth, and you can create specific topics and then group things under topics. So it's, I have one, again, I use one for kind of more, not necessarily work things, but I also have one for specific projects that I'm working on. And it's cut down a lot on our, on the email, like, hey, can you do this? Or is anybody in the model right now? Or I need to, I need this work set. Whoever's in it, close it out. You can just do that in Slack, and it stays in Slack. So that has been really, really useful. And again, it's pretty much free to use. They have a paid version, but you can go with the free version, and you can set up quickly, add users very quickly. So I highly suggest taking a look at it. So another thing when we come to information is, on your end, is to communicate more effectively. So in any of your communications, just think about the reader, show some empathy for the reader. And essentially this boils down to being clear and being concise. So it takes more time to write effectively, but it will save you time in the end. And it shows that, you respect other people's time as well as your own. So for any written communication, essentially, read your emails out loud to yourself, but also, use the appropriate format. Sometimes it makes sense to write something. Sometimes it makes sense to just give somebody a call. Maybe, a picture is worth 1,000 words, or even put together for a more complex topic, if you can, some kind of infographic. Here's a great book for design professionals, which has a kind of a style guide and tips for writing. I've been writing a lot more professionally over the last couple of years, so I've become much more aware of my own writing and critical of other people's writing. Getting back to communicating effectively, infographics, like I mentioned, are a great way for communicating complex information. As I mentioned before, too, mind maps are a good way to do this. So if you have, this is the mind map that I did for which architectural software is right for me. It allows you to just filter through a whole bunch of options pretty effectively. But I could think, if you're dealing with material choices or trying to develop or choose systems and then present that information to a client, an infographic could be a really effective way to do that. And again, it allows them to kind of see the big picture very quickly. They take some time to develop, obviously, but if in the end, it leads to a clearer understanding on everybody's part, then that's, time well spent. Okay, so we've got two more sections, and how are we doing on time? All right, it's a little bit after 3 o'clock, so hopefully you can stick around for another 15 minutes or so. And this is, the last two are kind of some of my favorite topics. So know your tools. One thing that I recommend, we all use tools. Some of us use physical tools. We use lots of digital tools. But what tools do you use on a regular basis? What software are you always in and out of? So I recommend taking a tool inventory, basically writing down, all the tools that you're using. Are you using Word, Excel? Like, do you use Revit, Photoshop? And how often do you use it on a daily basis? And then asking yourself, is that the best tool for the job? Am I using the software to its fullest capability? And are there other tools out there that could do a better job or could enhance the way that I'm working? Be objective, and you definitely want to invest in your tools in the sense like your computer is your toolbox. So as much as you can, sometimes you're restricted by what your company will allow you to install, but there's a lot of change that's happening in the industry, in the software industry. There's a lot of development that's going on. So there's a lot of interesting stuff, an interesting way to do things. So I think keeping an open mind about the tools you're using, and again, being objective and asking yourself, is this the best tool for the job? At least opens you up to some other possibilities. Now, if you determine, yes, this is the best tool, or this is the tool that I need to be using, figure out ways that you can kind of customize it to make it work better for you. Spend some time laying out your workspace, for each software that you use. Get rid of all the clutter in the interface like you would do with your desk. I mean, most modern software allows you to customize the user interface. So put things where you'll actually use them and make it work for you. And then think about, too, like how far you're going to have to move your mouse, and think about the ergonomics. If you can minimize unnecessary movement, it's going to allow you to work faster. And even shaving like a couple seconds off of doing like an operation that you do frequently, it's going to save you a lot of time in the aggregate over the course of a year. Now, use keyboard shortcuts. This is going to save you a ton of time. Again, most software will allow you to use shortcuts or even customize them. And if you think about it, if you can save like a minute or 2 minutes every hour using keyboard shortcuts, that ends up being 16 minutes per day. That's 80 minutes a week. And then over the course of a year, you're saving yourself a week and a half just by using keyboard shortcuts. So, what are you going to do with that time? Like take a vacation, work a little bit more, but shortcuts are really, really effective. And again, it's coming down to you're just shaving seconds off of repetitive tasks. So it's definitely worth the time learning the shortcuts, customizing them, making them work for you. Grab a sip of water. With that in mind, too, when's the last time you had training for your software? I know for me, it's been 10 years at least since I've had any Photoshop training. And Adobe comes out with a new version every year, and I just haven't stayed up to date with it. And that's kind of, the challenge that we face too is, we need to be working on projects. We don't always have time for training, but it's definitely worth it for tools that we use frequently to stay up to date and also to learn new ways to do things that we're currently doing. I go back to Photoshop because I learned to use it 10 years ago at least, maybe even 15. And I know I know how to do certain things a certain way. And I know that there's much, much better ways to do that. So I need to kind of force myself to learn more, to go to training, to figure out what's current. Because again, I haven't stayed up to date on that. And that's true for, other software as well. When I go back into ArchSmarter, when I started this whole Excel for Architects series of blog posts, I created this largely for myself. I realized I'd been using Excel for years, but I didn't know how to use it that much. I didn't know how to use any of the advanced features. So I figured out, well, I'm going to kind of teach myself, and I took some online courses, and I just played around with it and looking at like pivot tables. I'd heard of them, but I never knew how to use them. And I looked at formulas, and then I found out like it's really, really powerful, and I can actually do some interesting things here. If I had stuck to my same mentality, I wouldn't have gotten outside of what I thought I knew. So I had to kind of force myself to learn a little bit, but it's been really, really helpful. Now, going back to your tools as well, make smart upgrades. So, you have I think this is a Chevy. So, you can soup up your software and your hardware as much as you need to. Just go about it smart. Think about what the end goal is. But also, too, think about, this doesn't just apply to your just to your digital tools. You can think about it in terms of your physical tools as well. One of the best upgrades ever, I don't know if you can see this here in the webcam, but I got a thing for my notebook called a quiver, and it's essentially, it allows me to put my pen onto my notebook. So whenever I carry my notebook, I have a pen in this quiver. It's leather, it matches the color, it's great. So again, anytime that I go out, I grab my notebook, and I always have a pen with me. So that has been probably one of my favorite upgrades. But when you're thinking about upgrades, consider these criteria, like what are the costs going to be? And that the cost comes in twofold. There's the monetary cost. Is it going to, cost me money to do the upgrade? But there's also a cost in terms of time and productivity. So if I upgrade, this particular thing, am I going to be able to do things faster or do things that I couldn't do previously? Or is there going to be a hit? Like, am I going to have to? Is there a learning curve associated with it? Software companies have gotten very sophisticated about making sure that we upgrade and continue to pay. So you have subscription plans now, and so you're getting a new version every year. Is there enough in that version to justify the upgrade? Maybe, maybe not. But again, we're sort of getting used to thinking about software as a subscription as opposed to something that we purchase. But always keep your eye on the performance when you're thinking about upgrades. Like, how is this going to help me? Is this going to help me at all even? But also, too, look at, what other industries are using. Are there other tools out there that could be applied to my particular work? Okay, the last one, and a personal favorite, is automation. So looking at ways that we can automate our tasks. Automation is a great way that we can apply leverage. And we can automate things a number of different ways. One way to do it is by using checklists. That allows us to basically set out a series of tasks that need to get accomplished. Programming macros or batch processing things is another way. The idea is to make a process consistent and repeatable. That way we can audit it and we can, make improvements more easily. By making the steps explicit, then we can go through and determine whether or not, and how we need to fix it, how we can make that process optimum. And ultimately, it's going to save us time. So the first thing in this is to work lazy. And this is one of my those in fact are my feet. Yes. So find the fastest way to get something done and expend the least amount of effort for the most impact. So in anything I'm doing, I'm trying to work lazy, and I'm not using that, again, like I'm sitting back with my hands above my head. I'm just trying to do it the fastest and expend the least amount of effort, so I can then go do something else, and something else, and so on, something else. So again, I try to work lazy when I can. I'd rather spend an hour writing a program or a macro that automates a task than spend the hour to do it manually. And the reasons are twofold. One is that, it's more intellectually challenging for me than just clicking the mouse around, like if it's a particularly tedious task. But also, I can reuse that macro at a later date. So if I spend an hour and then I do, spend an hour to do a task, to automate a task, and then I need to do that task again, a couple of days later, I have a macro already written that's only going to take me 5 minutes. So if I start doing the math, if I had to do it manually, that's, say, 2 hours to do this task 2 different times. If I spend an hour writing a macro and then I run the macro, that's an hour and 5 minutes. So the more I do it and the more I do it, I'm getting returns over time. So that initial investment, I'm able to leverage that work much more significantly. Now, another way to automate is to outsource. And, outsourcing has kind of a bad, leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. But if you think about it, a certain way, we do a lot of outsourcing already. We might hire a cleaner for our house. We might hire somebody that will use a service to do our shopping. I don't like cutting my grass, so I have somebody who comes and cuts the grass for it. So we, even our dry cleaning, we're doing that sort of outsourcing our personal tasks. I use this site called Fancy Hands, which is essentially, virtual assistants who I can give them tasks, and they'll do them for me. And I have a subscription, so I pay a monthly fee. But I'll have them do things, that are work related. So I'll have them do proofreading, or if I'm sending out a blog post, I'll have them check links. I'll even have them do research, or I'll have them like book travel if I'm traveling somewhere. So it's good about, I use it, and I outsource tasks that either I don't particularly enjoy or that I'm not really good at. And there are some other sites that you could use as well. Something like Fiverr is another one, or Upwork, and you can, hire freelance workers to do stuff. So that is one, another way to think about outsourcing. It's not necessarily about moving jobs, outside of the country, but you can think about in your own work, are there ways, are there other people in your firm even that you can outsource tasks to? So here's basically what it looks like. And, all I do is I put in, the task, and then 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes later, they have an assistant who will go ahead and do that, and then they email me back. And so it's actually worked out pretty well for me. Now, another thing to consider too, and as far as automation goes, is to use templates. And, we used to have these templates, if you remember the hand drafting days. But templates allow us to standardize things. So you can standardize, your own documents. So you probably have templates in your office, like for Word documents. You may have if you're still using AutoCAD, you might have AutoCAD templates, or even within Revit, you have templates. But you can also create templates, for other types of files, or even like communication. So I have an invoice that I send a client every month, and I essentially, I was writing the same email at month after month after month. So what I did is I just created a template email, and then every time I need to send that out, I just, use the template to create a new message, add the invoice to it as an attachment, and then send it off. So I don't have to think about what I'm going to write. And it's not like I'm writing, paragraph after paragraph, but it's one of those things that, I just need to write a couple sentences. It's always consistent. If I just put it into a template, it makes it a lot easier for me, and I send it off a lot more quickly. So you can think about how you can use templates. And again, with email, it's great because if you do have typical correspondence that you send out, you can create that template, and then you don't have to think about what you're going to say. You can use this as well, like in sort of Microsoft Office documents, to take another step. You can create styles, like if you're creating consistent, or if you want your documents to look consistent from one to the next, you can create styles within those applications. Same thing like in PowerPoint, you can create a master slide. That way everything is consistent from one thing to the next. And that's the big point of using templates, is to ensure consistency. And then you don't have to think about it each time you're going to use that. Now, writing macros, again, if you want to get into automation, is a great way to do that. In Excel, you can do this, and you can actually record your actions as a macro, and it sort of writes, it'll take the actions on the screen, and then it will translate them into actual code, and Excel does that really well. AutoCAD has an action recorder, which doesn't work quite as well as the macro recorder in Excel, but this is kind of the beginning way to start writing code, getting started with automation. Unfortunately, Revit has macros, but it doesn't have a macro recorder. So if you want to automate Revit, you actually have to type out the code. But I had, when I was using AutoCAD, I had to format a door schedule, and so I was, taking data out of AutoCAD, putting it into Excel, and I was doing it frequently enough, and the formatting wanted to be specific, so I ended up just writing a macro in Excel to do the formatting. And I could just run it on any time I had that door schedule I needed to update it. It took me, again, probably like an hour to actually write the macro, and then it would take me like 10 seconds to run it. But it was great because I knew, instead of dreading like, oh man, I've got to reformat this door schedule, I just had to run the macro, and then it was done. So I probably would update it more frequently because I knew that part, the tedious part, was actually automated for me. So I didn't really have to worry about it. So again, doing an update wasn't a big deal. But macros are great for those types of things. Then to take it, Dynamo is another way. And if you sat in on my last webinar, I gave kind of an overview on how to use Dynamo. Dynamo is great because it's visual, and it's a way to automate Revit without coding. And you can also, they're starting to make this Dynamo available to other Autodesk applications as well. But essentially, rather than writing the code, you're assembling these blocks, or nodes as they're called. And you can do some really, really interesting stuff with it. There are some other ways, internet-based macro services. There's one called Zapier, and then there's another one, this one here called IFTTT, which stands for If This Then That, and it allows you to connect together different web apps like Gmail and Evernote. So if you were to get an email in Gmail from a particular person, you could create an IFTT that would send it to Evernote or wherever. So there's some really interesting stuff that you can do, workflow automation, using tools like this. And the last one, our 25th way to work smarter, is to learn to program. And yes, it is challenging. It takes some time. You really do have to commit yourself to it, but it's an extremely rewarding skill, and it can really help you work much, much faster. There are a lot of resources available. I've certainly written about it a lot on ArchSmarter, but there's online schools like Udemy, Code School. I have a Revit programming class through ArchSmarter, but the gist of it is, and in the end, it allows you a way to make your own tools. And as you're doing this, it helps you think about problems in a logical way. So you're looking at problems and then you're breaking them down into chunks, and then you're iterating through and solving the problem step by step. So I had tried a number of times to learn to program, and then I just, committed myself, sat down, and did it. And now, it has changed the way I think about certain problems for sure. Again, because you can be much more systematic about it. So that's all of our 25 ways to work more effective. I ran a little bit longer than I intended, but thanks for sticking around. And this is sort of the last thing I want to leave you with is, make sure to take care of yourself. So if you're working more effectively, you're being more efficient, in the end, take care of yourself. You are your most valuable asset. There's no other person like you. So make sure you get enough sleep. It's not all about work. Make sure you exercise, eat well, take breaks, keep an eye on your energy levels, nurture your relationships, and don't work too hard. Again, time is our most valuable asset. Take care of yourself. It's not all about the work in the end. And I just wanted to thank you for making it through to the end. I'd love to hear your feedback on this session. So, email your comments or suggestions. One of my goals for this year is to turn this this presentation into either a book or a course. So, I would love to hear your suggestions, comments. If you have any particular tips, I would love to hear it. Like I said at the beginning, I am recording this session, so I will have it available probably tomorrow. And then I am also going to include on the recording webpage, I'll have links to all the things that I mentioned during the presentation. So thanks again, and get out there and work hard, but don't work too hard, okay? Thank you.